a 16-year-old girl went for a run and disappeared. The police began an investigation that would ultimately last 38 years. When the truth came out, people were, without exaggeration, shocked. It turns out the case could have been solved in just a few weeks, but instead the search for answers took nearly 4 decades. In this video, we will tell you what happened to Joyce McLean. Joyce McLean was born on September 4, 1963. When she was little, her family moved to a tiny town called East Millinocket, located almost on the very edge of the United States. From early childhood, she was interested in music. The girl quickly mastered several instruments, but her favorite was the saxophone. She loved to compose her own compositions and was part of the school music group. In addition, she was on the cheerleading team, played football, and was generally a very active participant in school life. At the end of the summer holidays in 1980, Joyce was preparing for her upcoming 17th birthday. She had recently received her driver's license and was planning to go to the Lake Shaw with friends and relatives to celebrate her birthday. The girl was even going to invite a local musical group there. Joyce had 2 more classes to complete before she planned to go to college. The girl prepared for this in advance, so she studied only with excellent marks, and also earned various sporting and musical achievements. On August 8th, she and her friends spent the day at the lake, after which I decided to go for a run. Joyce loved sports, but running was not her favorite activity. Despite this, in the new school year she had to participate in school football matches, and she made every effort to keep herself in shape. The girl went for a run at about 7:30 in the evening. She usually ran in the company of her friend, but that evening she was busy. Joyce had a standard route. She made several circles along the road walking around her tiny town. This usually took about an hour, but that evening the girl never returned home. Several hours had passed since Joyce left, and her mother began to worry seriously. The girl always informed her parents about where she was going, and if after a run she went for a walk with friends, her parents would already know about it. Her mother decided to go in search and drove around the city by car. She asked all the neighbors who came along the way, but no one saw Joyce. Considering that in this small town the vast majority of residents knew each other, several more people joined the search. Night was approaching, and the girl was still nowhere to be found. Then the worried parents decided to contact the police. Local officers also joined the search, and in the following hours, more and more city residents took to the streets. They combed the route along which Joyce ran, as well as the area behind the school. Unfortunately, they were unable to find any trace of the girl. Every hour the panic only grew, and few people hoped to find Joyce alive and unharmed. It was late at night, and the police completely ruled out the possibility that the girl could have gone somewhere with friends. The problem was that all her friends were at home and later joined the search. Joyce's parents simply couldn't imagine their daughter deciding to go somewhere alone until nightfall. It was never possible to find her, and the search dragged on for 2 days. All this time, the police, together with city residents, continued to explore the area until, on August 10, they finally made a heartbreaking discovery. Joyce's body was discovered just 60 meters from the school's playgrounds, not far from the trees. The girl was lying on the ground. Almost all of her clothes were missing. Her hands were tied behind her back with a piece of blue cloth. The police immediately realized that the victim had suffered a heavy blow to the head, but a more detailed analysis had to be done by a medical expert. After examining the body, they came to the conclusion that the girl received multiple blows to the head, and death occurred in the evening of the same day when she disappeared. And despite the almost complete lack of clothing, the unknown criminal did not subject her to violence. Unfortunately, no other information could be obtained. There were no foreign DNA samples on the body, and in the early 80s this technology was only in its infancy. The first person in history to be convicted thanks to DNA analysis was arrested only in 1987. Thus, the police faced a complex investigation with a minimal set of evidence. Soon after the discovery of the body, The officer found Joyce's clothes, but this also did not bring them any closer to the solution. News of the brutal murder quickly spread throughout the city, plunging it into a very gloomy state. As is usually the case, residents of such tiny towns in the wilderness have never encountered murder. And adding even more worry was the fact that the killer was still somewhere nearby, and his identity remains unknown. Given the complete lack of evidence, several theories circulated around the city. The most popular was the following: Joyce's body was found near a place where not the most prosperous youth usually gathered. They often drank alcohol there at night, and also took illegal substances. People thought that a group of these tipsy guys might have accosted Joyce, and things got out of control. The police even checked the local residents, and who regularly spent time in those companies, but they were unable to establish their involvement. Another version said that the killer could have been a person who came for seasonal work. Hundreds of people constantly came to this area, since there were not enough locals alone to fill all the vacancies. But here the police could not find any evidence. Someone even began to suspect the volunteer who discovered Joyce's body. The fact is that most of the time he explored the area together with another volunteer. However, on the morning of the last day, I went out searching alone. Because of this, a version of his involvement arose, but here the police were unable to confirm his guilt. There was another version. It turned out that on the very night when Joyce disappeared, a serious accident occurred not far from the city. 19-year-old local resident snuck into the garage and stole a fuel truck from there, after which he crashed into another car. He suffered serious head injuries and collapsed in his room for 9 days, because of which the police simply could not interrogate him, and when he came to his senses, he declared his innocence. Investigators didn't know what to do next. They had no evidence or witnesses. As a result of this, the case went on the back burner for years, due to the fact that the police were unable to get closer to the solution. 8 years later, Joyce's relatives started a petition calling for their daughter's murders to be featured on a national unsolved crime show. This would allow the message to reach audiences across America and draw the attention of potential witnesses. There is always the possibility that someone heard or saw something but for some reason did not report it to the police. The petition collected 6,000 signatures, and the authors of the program agreed to make their own story. It was released in 1989, and the police actually received a lot of calls. But all the information collected turned out to be either erroneous or outright false. Unfortunately, this happens in almost every well-known case. People either make mistakes or simply lie and invent non-existent facts, forcing the police to waste time and resources on checks. After that, the case froze for several more years. But all this time, Mama Joyce continued to fight for the truth. In the mid-2000s, she decided that new technologies and techniques in the field of forensics could help uncover evidence that had been missed in the 80s. To do this, an expert had to exhume the victim's body, but this had its own difficulties. Initially, the authorities rejected the mother's request for exhumation. They believed that after almost 30 years, any possible evidence simply had not been preserved, but the woman continued to insist on her own. And in 2007, she managed to get this issue off the ground. Medical expert Peter Cummings contributed greatly to this because of his compassion. He was only 5 years old at the time of Joyce's murder. Despite such a young age, he perfectly remembered the horror into which his city had plunged. Peter admitted that it was these events that directed him into the field of criminology and medicine. When he learned that the authorities had rejected Joyce's mother's request for exhumation, he contacted her and asked her not to give up this idea. Peter believed that the remains might have been preserved well enough to try to extract evidence from them. He also contacted one of the leading forensic experts in the United States, who became interested in the case. Mama Joyce decided to take the initiative into her own hands and organize an independent examination. Exhumation at their own expense required approximately $20,000, which the family did not have. But they had the support of caring people who, after so many years, still remembered this matter. With their help, the family quickly collected the required amount, and the exhumation took place in 2008. To the surprise of many, the expert actually managed to discover some important evidence, but at that time they kept this information secret. Investigators only said that this discovery would not be followed by an immediate arrest, but the police immediately reopened the case. A few months later, it became known that unidentified people had desecrated Joyce's grave. Police said they don't know if it has anything to do with the murder investigation. The next serious turn occurred a year later, in 2009, and this moment may have become key, since law enforcement agencies for the first time in 29 years announced the presence of a prime suspect. Let's go back to 1980. As we remember, a few hours after Joyce's murder, a local resident stole a fuel truck and had a serious accident with it, which is why he fell into a coma. A man was 19-year-old Scott Fournier, and in 2009, he was put on trial for storing prohibited materials with minors. It seemed that the two cases were in no way connected. It was only after the verdict was announced that the judge suddenly announced that Scott, a person of interest in the murder of Joyce McLean, calling on the man to confess to his crime. This news greatly surprised Joyce's relatives. They all knew Scott and knew that the police were considering him as a suspect because of that accident. But why did the judge officially declare him a person of interest after 29 long years? The lead detective on the case declined to comment. He only said that since the exhumation, he has made significant progress, and the investigation continues at full speed. Scott was sentenced to 6.5 years in prison for possession of prohibited materials. This was the minimum sentence, despite having a criminal history. He was tried in 79, 80, and 84 for theft. But all these crimes happened too long ago to affect the amount of time in the current case. He also came on police radar in 2001 when his 6-year-old daughter complained that he was molesting her. Despite the fact that law enforcement agencies believed the girl, they could not prove the crime, and Scott did not suffer any punishment. All of the above already seems sufficient for a man to be seriously considered for the role of Joyce's killer. But as it turned out, this is just the tip, and beyond, everything is much worse. Unfortunately, this matter dragged on for several more years. While the man was in prison, investigators kept the evidence they collected secret and interviewed possible witnesses. In 2015, they assembled a group of 10 people and re-examined the area where Joyce's body was found. At the end of the search, they did not provide any details. But a year later, everything fell into place. On March 4, 2016, the police officially announced the arrest of the suspect. Scott Fournier, who had only recently been released from prison, was taken into custody and charged with the murder of Joyce McLean. Scott, who was already 55 years old at that time, refused to admit his guilt, and the case went to trial. He spent almost 2 years in prison while awaiting his first hearing because he didn't have $300,000 for bail. The trial only began in 2018, and the public finally learned something truly strange. It turned out that Scott had confessed to killing Joyce multiple times just weeks after the fact. One day he burst into tears and confessed to his mother and sister that he had killed Joyce. On other occasions, he told a local priest, a married couple he knew, and his work colleague about what he had done. Some of these confessions did not reach the police until years later, but some of them became known almost immediately. Scott was interrogated, but he began to deny his guilt. The guy referred to head injuries received during the accident. According to him, he really thought he killed Joyce, but now he believes that in reality, this never happened. In total, he was interrogated 27 times, and Scott kept changing his stories. At first, he told the police that he killed Joyce by striking her several times with glass insulator from power lines that was lying nearby. The girls were actually killed right under the power line. Scott further stated that he tied her hands, abused her, and fled. In this story, the police were confused by one fact. Firstly, They were never able to accurately identify the murder weapon, even though a glass insulator was found near the body. Secondly, Joyce was not abused, as evidenced by the medical expert's report, but otherwise his story was very close to the truth. During subsequent interrogations, he stated that he killed Joyce in the company of other guys. Then he said that he simply watched as they attacked her. Then he changed his testimony again and said that these guys forced him to participate in the crime. There were many similar stories, and at the investigation stage the detectives were simply confused. They did not have a single solid piece of evidence against Scott, and his versions changed during each interrogation. For this reason, he was not arrested all these years. Only over time did they manage to collect enough data to bring the case to trial. This was assisted by two witnesses, a priest and a colleague of Scott's, who both heard his confession. A colleague asked the guy how he managed to avoid punishment. Scott responded that he simply bombarded the police with false stories about other people's involvement, which threw them off the scent. The colleague reported the conversation to his superiors, but not to the police. Apparently, they never passed this information on to law enforcement agencies. He admitted to the priest that he did not abuse Joyce because she was menstruating at the time, and this became one of the key factors. The police never disclosed this information, although they became aware of it after examining the girl's body. It turns out that Scott simply could not know such details unless he himself was a killer. Scott's lawyers insisted that all the evidence was circumstantial. Confessions of his client blamed it on head injuries received as a result of the accident. They also referred to the fact that the police did not arrest the man immediately after he first confessed to the murder. In addition, the lawyers reproached the court for refusing to consider other suspects. For example, they tried to put all the blame on Peter, who discovered Joyce's body. That morning he was supposed to go in search of the girl in tandem with another volunteer. They agreed to meet at 6 in the morning, but Peter never showed up. The volunteer later learned that he had gone out early to search and found a body. But there is one strange moment here too. This volunteer's sister lived next door to Peter, and that morning she saw the man leave the house at dawn. According to the woman, he was carrying a large sports bag. When he returned home after finding the body, he looked happy and smiling. This story seems dubious, if only for the reason that the volunteer reported all this to the police only 16 years after the murder. This already looks strange, and it is simply impossible to verify the authenticity of his words. Unfortunately, Peter died of a heart attack just 2 days before Scott's arrest. For this reason, no one will know why he went out searching earlier. But police said there was no evidence linking him to the murder. The prosecution denied all the lawyers' arguments. They assured that the police considered all possible suspects and were unable to find even a hint of their involvement. Scott, on the other hand, gave reasons for suspicion many times. Evan, his stepfather, told police early in the investigation that he suspected Scott of murder. According to him, a few days before the incident, the guy said that he planned to start running in the evenings. He also mentioned that he had a crush on Joyce. Moreover, when Scott first confessed to the murder, he was asked to show where he attacked Joyce. The guy led investigators to exactly the place where the body was found. To support the version of his involvement, they referred to several other witnesses. On the evening of the day of Joyce's murder at approximately 9 o'clock, a married couple saw Scott running near the scene of Joyce's murder with a bottle of alcohol in his hands. That's just according to them. An unknown young man was running next to him. At that time, they did not yet know that the girls' bodies would be found there. But later they reported this to the police. An hour and a half earlier, 2 local teenagers also saw Scott and an unknown young man running through the area. A trial lasted just over 2 weeks, and on February 5, 2018, the final decision was made. Scott was found guilty of Joyce's murder and sentenced to 45 years in prison. On that moment, man was 57 years old, and such a sentence virtually guaranteed that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. In 2019, Scott's lawyers filed an appeal. which resulted in the appointment to hearing. However, the court did not change the original verdict. According to the judge, the evidence against the criminal was exhaustive, and all the defense arguments had no weight. Joyce's family has lifted from their shoulders the heavy burden of ignorance that had been with them for 38 years. All this time they fought for the truth, and her mother made the greatest contribution. This woman dedicated her entire life to achieving justice. Ultimately, she went even further and contributed to the adoption of a law, thanks to which the authorities began to allocate significant funds to the creation of departments to combat unsolved murders.